I'd like to say good evening and welcome to the Champaign County Master Gardeners Program on Herbicide Drift. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Diane Plewa is a plant diagnostic specialist with the University of Illinois Extension, serving as the director of the plant clinic and the state IPM coordinator. She is responsible for the diagnosis of agricultural and ornamental plant samples received at the plant clinic and for overseeing plant clinic services, including outreach focused around plant health and management. She works closely with state and federal regulatory agencies regarding the detection and management of invasive plant pests and pathogens to Illinois. Diane earned her BS in crop science from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana and her MS in plant pathology from the Ohio State University. Prior to working at the plant clinic, she was a horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension. And welcome, Diane. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I need to shorten that bio a little bit, I think, but thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to talk to you guys. So I will be honest, I don't love Zoom. I know it's kind of a necessary evil at this point, and I know it allows for more people to attend, which is great, but I really miss seeing people face to face. So usually when I do presentations, I like having more of a conversation. This topic is a little bit more difficult, I think, to do that with. But if you have questions, please either put them in the chat box or we will have a chance at the end, I think, for questions. So again, if you have questions or comments or things like that, I'm going to be completely honest at the very beginning. I'm not a herbicide expert. Again, my background is in plant pathology, but I'm going to share with you what I know and some of the trends that we see. And then again, if you have questions or comments at the end, we can talk about those. And if I don't know the answer, I will try to find that out for you. So with that, again, thank you so much for inviting me. I really do enjoy getting to do this type of outreach. As mentioned, I was a horticulture educator for about a year. That was my introduction to extension. That was my first job working full-time at the university. I actually served in the Champaign, Vermilion, Fort Iroquois counties, so has a place close to my heart, and I always love coming back and getting to kind of reconnect with the group. So again, thank you. So today, talking about herbicide drift concerns, talking about some of the things we look for and some of the things that it can easily be mistaken for or with. I will be honest, this topic can be a little dry, and it can also be a little frustrating because at the end, as you'll see, the answer to like, how do I diagnose herbicide injury is, well, you kind of don't. But I'm hoping to give you guys some ideas. Also, I know that different groups handle how they deal with herbicide or diagnosing herbicide or talking about herbicides differently. So obviously what I'm telling you is coming from my perspective, but definitely check with the Master Gardener Coordinator, with Ryan, with your EPCs, just to make sure that I know that certain extension offices or groups have like slightly different kind of guidelines for how they want to talk about herbicide potential injury. And there are good reasons for that, because sometimes these things do have legal consequences. And the last thing we want to do is kind of get involved in something that that maybe we don't have like the absolute positive proof. But like I said, we'll talk more about that as we get into it. So basically this first picture, just so you know, this is a picture of my lawn, and I am perfectly happy with this lawn. Frankly, for me, I just want my grass or my lawn to be a green carpet about yay tall that I can mow and walk in barefoot. So to me, having grass, clover, violets, dandelions, creeping Charlie, henbit, these are all perfectly fine for me. I understand that that is a personal choice. I used to teach lawn for Master Gardener training, so I understand that this is, again, a very divisive subject for some people. That being said, I included this because, as you can tell, I think, by looking at this picture, I don't use any herbicides in my lawn. And that's not for me to say that that's the right thing to do. That's just what I choose to do. But lawns are a very common source of some of our kind of urban herbicide applications. And it's just something to keep in mind because, and again, we'll touch on this more, but I'm sure most of you have heard of like weed and feed products that you can apply to lawns that have a fertilizer, and then they usually have, in this case, like a broadleaf herbicide. And so the idea is that you are both fertilizing your lawn and you are also removing any weeds that may be present. A lot of people don't understand that the weed part is a herbicide. And so we talk to a lot of clients who they either see that it's a product for lawns and see that it has a fertilizer in it and then think that they can also use it on their ground cover, for example, and then they are confused as to why their ivy or their vinca or their, creeping thyme or whatever whatever ground cover that may be, why it's not looking so good. We also get a lot of people that if we say we suspect a herbicide injury issue in their yard, we sometimes get a lot of pushback from people because, well, we never use herbicides. And then you look at pictures and you see this perfectly manicured lawn and you say, okay, how do you get that perfectly manicured lawn? And they'll start listing all of the products that they use, and those include herbicides, but they may not recognize that. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. Lawns are kind of, they're a common source of potential herbicide contact, shall we say. All right, so this slide is awful, and I apologize. I just wanted to quickly go over some terms that we're all kind of talking about the same things. You don't need to memorize these, but this is just to kind of quickly go through some of the things that we consider when we talk about herbicides, because herbicide is an incredibly broad topic. A herbicide is just basically any chemical that we use to control a plant, a weed, but a weed is just a plant growing in the wrong place. So herbicides can be synthetic, they can be organic, they can be all natural. You can even, I wouldn't necessarily recommend these, but you can find recipes online for using dish soap as a herbicide. So things can be non-toxic. The point is that anything that we're using specifically to control, any type of chemical that we're using to control weeds, that would be considered a herbicide. So again, that's an incredibly broad definition. So these are just some things to keep in mind as we're talking about herbicides in general. One of the ways we can talk about different types of herbicides is how they're applied. So are they a foliar versus a soil applied herbicide? A foliar just means that it's applied to the leaves or the stems of the plant. Soil is obviously applied to the soil. Some of these are going to be used, soil tends to be used in the beginning of the season, often before either things are planted or before plants have emerged. And then foliar is going to usually be used later in the season when you have actively growing green tissue. We have selective versus non-selective. A selective herbicide is just a herbicide that doesn't affect all type of plants. And usually the most kind of common breakdown there would be broadleaf plants versus grass. But again, remember that when it says selective, it's based on the plant biology. It's not based on what you want to have growing there. And I've had conversations with people who applied a selective herbicide to like a flower garden, and then were very upset when their ornamentals suffered damage along with the creeping Charlie. Because I think in their head they were thinking, well, I know what plants I want to control. I want to kill the creeping Charlie, and therefore this herbicide should only affect the weed, the creeping Charlie. And these examples I'm giving you, it's not because people are stupid. And this is something I talk about when I do Master Gardener disease training. This is not to make fun of the general public or to say that they're stupid. Really, it's just that not everyone understands how plants work. And so what may seem obvious to us, for example, a herbicide is going to cause phytotoxicity. It's going to cause damage to plants. Again, people don't always think that all the way through. So these are just, again, some examples of conversations I've had over the past 10 years or so working at the clinic, and some of the trends I've noticed. So selective just means, again, that it's going to affect a certain group of plants. Non-selective means it will hit everything. One thing to keep in mind is that there are selective herbicides that if they are applied at a high enough rate, or if the environmental conditions are appropriate or inappropriate, I guess, depending on how you look at it, that can make a selective herbicide act in a non-selective manner. So you can have injury that occurs even when you're using a selective herbicide, again, under certain conditions. But generally speaking, if they're applied according to label, if nothing goes horribly wrong, you should have a little bit more discrimination in terms of which plants are hit. We can also talk about when the herbicide is applied. So you have pre-plant herbicide; those are used before planting anything. It's often used, for example, if you are starting from scratch and reseeding a lawn. These can often also be used in agricultural systems. So if you are starting a new, field of tomatoes or cucurbits, or even in corn or soybean, things like that, a pre-plant herbicide is usually very effective. The point is kind of to kill everything. It's not going to kill everything, but the point is to try and kind of remove as much living plant matter as possible. So there is obviously a labeled, there's going to be an interval after you apply that pre-plant herbicide until when you can plant back into that soil, because basically you have to wait until any residual activity is finished so that you're not dosing the soil and then putting in the seeds that you want to grow right into that soil that you've already adulterated essentially with this with the herbicide. Pre-emergence herbicide, that's done after planting, but before emergence. The idea is that it kills weeds upon emergence. Those, again, you have to be a little careful with the timing, because if you put it, basically, if you put it before the desirable plants have fully emerged and established, you may end up hurting them. And then if you do it too late, the undesirable plants or the weeds may have essentially already established. They might take a little bit of damage, but that might not fully control them. So pre-emergence herbicide can be a bit tricky in terms of timing. Again, there's going to be labeled intervals in terms of when plants can be put back into that area. And then post-emergence herbicides, these are going to be the ones that we tend to use the most in like urban situations. These are going to be applied usually foliar applications, and they're going to be made during the growing season when the plants are green and growing and actively transpiring. We also have how the herbicide moves within the plant, so contact versus systemic herbicides, and there are gradations, right? Very few things are like entirely one thing or entirely another, but generally speaking, contact herbicides do not move within the plant. So basically, wherever that herbicide droplet falls, that is going to be the tissue that's affected. It is not going to then move into the plant and move to a different part of the plant. So with contact herbicide, you tend to see necrosis usually. So you see either browning or bleaching or yellowing of the tissue. It sometimes is in kind of a round pattern, like a droplet pattern, or even like a spray pattern or a runoff pattern. And with contact herbicides, they tend to work pretty quickly. So you tend to see damage in a couple hours, sometimes hours to a day. So if you have a contact herbicide application, you should see results pretty quickly, assuming that it's not a resistant plant or that there wasn't a problem with that application. With systemic, those herbicides are going to, I don't know if you could hear that. That was a very loud motorcycle revving right outside of my window. With systemic herbicides, those herbicides are going to move within the plant, usually through the vascular system. So they are going to be translocated to a different area of the plant. And it's going to depend on the type of herbicide. Some of them are translocated down into the roots. Some of them are translocated up into the leaves. Sometimes they show up in the newest growth. So they'll show up in the developing leaves. Sometimes they'll show up in older leaves. So the systemic herbicides are going to show up in different parts of the plant, but it will not be specifically the place where they were applied. And systemic herbicides, usually you don't see damage for several days to several weeks. So those tend to take quite a bit longer for you to see efficacy of those herbicides. We can talk about how herbicides move off target. So the two big ones are going to be drift versus splash. Splash is going to be a lot more localized. It's usually just, if you are making an application and either if the wind kicks up a lot, or if you kind of twitch while you're applying the herbicide or something like that, it's going to be very localized, where the droplets, which are big fat droplets of the herbicide application, are going to move slightly off topic, or excuse me, move slightly off target. So those tend to be, again, pretty localized, and usually it's pretty obvious because there's going to be other plants that herbicide was applied to in the very local vicinity. Drift, on the other hand, can be either a vapor drift or like an aerosol, and that can move for miles depending on the type of herbicide, depending on the weather patterns, depending on temperature, things like that. So with drift, certain herbicides are more prone to drifting off target. And these can be a little bit trickier to figure out because, again, they can move for miles. And so you may not see where that application originally was done, but you may see symptoms. And then we can also talk about mode of action. Mode of action is just how the herbicide works on a biochemical level. It's really interesting, but it's way more than I'm going to get into today. But the idea is that you have a number of different modes of actions. This is how the chemical actually interacts with the plant. And what does it do? Does it cause bleaching of the chlorophyll and therefore the plant can't photosynthesize as well? Does it cause root tip necrosis, so the root or the plant is no longer able to put out new feeder roots? Does it cause distortion of the new growth, so the new growth is not functioning properly? You know, those are all general kind of categories of modes of action. You may have heard of mode of action in terms of herbicides when if you're considering applying a fungicide, you're told to switch the mode of action if possible, so that way you try to avoid or delay herbicide resistance from developing, because if we are constantly applying the same mode of action over and over and over again to the same population of a pathogen, we're basically selecting for those individuals that are resistant, very similar to insecticide resistance as well. So you may have heard of mode of action when people say, we'll try to choose different modes of action or different chemicals so that you don't end up encouraging resistance. So again, I know the slide was super boring, so I apologize, but I just wanted to go over some words that we're going to use, some definitions. Don't worry if you didn't memorize them, but the idea is just to kind of start thinking about the different ways that we can classify some of these chemicals. So this is just an example of a mode of action group or a mode of action chart. Again, we're not going too far in depth because this gets very complicated very quickly, and this is not my area of expertise. I just wanted to show you that there are a number of different types of modes of action. And again, it depends, or it's based on how that chemical interacts with the plant. So you can have cellular metabolism. If it interrupts how the cell is able to metabolize, how the cell is able to function essentially, then I think we can all imagine that if our cells weren't functioning properly, that is going to cause problems for the organism. Cell division and growth, if the cells are not able to divide and grow properly, again, you're going to start seeing major problems in terms of reproduction with that plant, vegetative or sexual. So the thing to keep in mind here is just there are lots of different modes of action. The other thing that's important is that symptoms, different modes of action are going to lead to different symptomology. So this is one of the frustrating things with herbicides is that we have a lot of different groups of herbicides, a lot of different modes of action, and that's great from a trying to delay resistance point of view. That's good. It's also good when it comes to dealing with particularly difficult species, because some herbicides work better on woody invasives, for example, versus herbaceous annuals. So having that flexibility is really good. The frustration comes in the fact that that means there isn't like a good rule of thumb in terms of, oh, these 3 symptoms to look for, that's herbicide. You know, we don't have that kind of nice symptomology that we can look for and say, oh, that is classic herbicide. There are some things that we can say, well, that looks highly suspicious, but because there's all this variability, it's really difficult to just look at a sample and immediately say, well, this looks like chemical. So talking about symptoms, they're going to, again, be extremely varied, as I just mentioned. It depends on the type of host. Different plants are going to react differently. Again, we have everything from woody perennials, like a large tree, all the way down to herbaceous annuals, like petunias. Those hosts are going to, they may interact with the chemical differently. The other thing is certain plants are more sensitive to certain types of herbicides. And again, that's great when it comes to controlling weeds. You know, if we want to control Creeping Charlie, there are some herbicides that work okay, and then there are some herbicides that work very well. And we obviously want to choose the ones that work very well. The drawback is that some of the plants that we like, some of the plants that we are specifically growing, tend to be extremely sensitive to certain types of herbicides. For example, tomatoes are extremely sensitive to plant growth regulators. So, you know, even if we get just a little whiff of plant growth regulator, even if other plants in the area look good, if the tomatoes are starting to show symptoms, it can be an indicator that there was some chemical contact, because they're almost like the canary in the coal mine in terms of their sensitivity. Grapes also extremely sensitive to plant growth regulators. Again, the type of herbicide is going to determine what type of symptoms we'd expect to see. The application timing. And again, this is something you're probably familiar with if you've ever used herbicides to control weeds, but there are certain growth stages that are more susceptible to herbicide injury than others. Generally speaking, the earlier in the season that we can hit something, the better. A lot of times if it's an annual, a lot of times our seedlings are going to be more susceptible to herbicide injury. On the other hand, if we're looking at perennials, spring is usually not the best time to apply a herbicide, because they are translocating, or at least not a systemic herbicide, because they are translocating everything out of the roots up. And so if we start applying things to the leaves, it's not going down into the roots. It's not going down into the plant system. It's getting pushed upwards. You might see some damage on some leaves, but depending on the plant, especially if it's a particularly pernicious one, like honeysuckle, for example, which I'm currently dealing with in my yard, it will just, some leaves might die and then it'll just put out new leaves. It barely phases it. So the application timing is really important in terms of what sort of symptomology we're going to see. It's also, again, really important in terms of actually controlling the plants we want to control. And then environmental factors are really critical. A lot of herbicides, I mentioned, some of them can essentially vaporize, or they can move like aerosol drift through wind, or through temperature inversions, things like that. And the environment is going to have a huge impact on that. Certain herbicides under certain environmental conditions are more prone to move off target. You may be familiar with dicamba. You may have heard of dicamba. It is a herbicide that is currently being used more by the agricultural community than there are new formulations which are being used more, and they are less prone to movement, which is great, but they still move. And so some states, including Illinois, have put pretty strict barriers as to when you are allowed to apply dicamba. So you can only apply it earlier in spring. You can't apply it, and I can't remember in Illinois what the cutoff date is, but there's a cutoff date, because after that date, the temperatures are going to be so high that it's going to really favor the off-target movement of things like dicamba. So again, the environmental factors can be really important. Environmental factors can also be important because they not only affect how the chemical performs in the environment, they also impact how our plants grow and how they develop. And so if we have a cold, wet spring, for example, I mentioned pre-emergent herbicides earlier. There are herbicides that are applied, I'm specifically thinking of soybean fields, which I know is not really an urban issue, but there are certain herbicides that are applied, and the idea is that the soybeans will grow quickly enough that they will kind of grow through the herbicide contact. They might get a little bit of a little burn, but they'll be fine. And usually they are. The idea is that, you might kind of ding the soybeans a little bit, but you're really killing all of the weeds, and that's what's critical here. However, if we have a cold, wet spring and those soybean plants take a lot longer to germinate, or they germinate very slowly, and so they're staying in the soil longer, as the hypocotyl is coming out of the seed and it's pushing up through the surface. If that hypocotyl stays in the soil for too long and that soil has been treated with a herbicide, that can start having a larger and larger kind of detrimental effect on that soybean plant, because that soybean plant is now having a lot more contact with the herbicide than was really intended. So again, environmental factors can affect how the herbicides move in the environment, but it can also impact how the plants grow and develop, and how those plants grow and develop in turn is going to have an impact on how those herbicides are metabolized, which then can lead to varying amounts of damage. This book, The Field Guide to Herbicide Injury on Landscape Plants, is actually a really, really good book. It's a little field guide. It's published by U of I Extension. I did put the link to the Pubs Plus website. I think it's $12 plus tax. I don't know that everyone needs to run out and buy a copy of it. and again, I get no I get no commission from this, so this is not a sponsored post or anything like that. But I would say that this is a good book to have on hand, like in the Master Gardener library, for example, or just kind of as a reference that you have, access to, even if you don't need your own personal copy. But it has good pictures, and then it also has a lot of information, things to consider when you are trying to think about, is this herbicide drift or not? So I just want to kind of show you some pictures of classic herbicide symptoms. Again, this part was actually kind of hard for me. On one hand, it was fun because pictures are fun and it's fun going through things and, putting pictures up because it's a lot more exciting than a bunch of definitions. But I just said I was trying to find kind of classic symptoms. And again, herbicides don't necessarily have classic symptoms, but these are some of the, again, the trends. These are the things that we tend to see or we tend to look for when we're thinking about, could this be herbicide damage, when we're trying to address that. So in this case, these are plant growth regulators. This includes dicamba, includes 2,4-D, but there's a huge range of plant growth regulators that are used. The picture on the left with the blue background, those are strawberries, if you can believe that. One thing to notice on these plants, the leaves are extremely distorted, and they're distorted in a specific way. The veins are running almost parallel. So this is called leaf strapping, where you have the leaf becomes very elongated, and then the veins are distorted. So instead of fanning out like you would like on a normal strawberry leaf, you should have kind of a more of a dispersed vein conformation. Instead, the veins are all, it looks like someone just kind of took the leaf and pulled it as it was developing. So you have these extremely elongated leaves. You also do have a little bit of discoloration going on. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but you have some yellowing that's occurring, especially in like the upper two leaves. Also, the margins of the leaves, so especially on the tips of the leaves, they're extremely wavy. They're kind of crinkly looking. And again, that is something that tends to be a symptom of plant growth regulator contact. On the right with the brown background, that is a grape leaf. As I mentioned, grapes are extremely susceptible or extremely sensitive to plant growth regulator or herbicide injury. Again, if you look at this leaf, grape leaves are supposed to kind of be fan shaped. They should open up a lot more than this one is. Again, you can see those parallel veins. They're kind of clustered in the very middle of the leaf. They're running parallel to each other. There is a little bit of discoloration, a bit of a yellowing or a whitening, especially along the veins. There is some leaf distortion, some bumping or rugosity. And this is a little bit difficult because grape leaves, the margins are usually a little bit frilly, but again, the margins look fairly wavy or frilly here. So these are some of those, again, classic symptoms that we would look for, that if we saw something like this, one possibility I would say would be, oh, this could be a herbicide issue. There are other things that can cause similar things, and at the end I will talk about some lookalikes, but the idea is that when we're first looking at these types of samples, we're trying to start off with just saying, what could these be? Like, how do we, what are possibilities? So I would say that both of these are extremely suspect for herbicide if I saw them on a sample. So some more plant growth regulators. Again, the plant growth regulator is probably the herbicide group that we see the most in terms of damage at the plant clinic, and that we receive the most calls about or questions about. So I have some extra pictures of these on the left with the kind of dark gray background. That's a maple leaf. Once again, I wish we were doing this more like in person, because then I could just ask you guys. But looking at this sample, I hope that you notice that the veins look fairly parallel, something that we don't usually associate with maple leaves. So again, those veins running very parallel, especially at the base. Again, there's a little bit of wrinkling, although this is the underside of the leaf, so it's difficult to see. A little bit of discoloration. Those are the symptoms that I see and say, this looks like potential herbicide damage. And then we don't tend to see herbicide damage on evergreens as much, so I wanted to include a couple pictures because I just thought this was kind of cool. This is on, I believe this is Austrian pine. or Scots pine. I think this is Scots pine actually. But it's one of our 2-needle pines, and you can see that the older growth looks fairly good. The needles are long and straight and dark green, but then the new growth is extremely curly and twisty. Like the new growth looks like, I don't know, green ramen noodles, like they're completely curled and twisted. And again, that type of distortion, curling or twisting, is also fairly indicative of plant growth regulator herbicide contact. And then just a couple more pictures on the left here with the gray background. That's a tomato. I mentioned tomatoes are extremely sensitive to plant growth regulator herbicides. This tomato was hit pretty hard, but you can see from this picture, we have leaves that are extremely distorted. They are twisted, they are leaf strapped. So again, they're kind of, looks like they've been pulled. They're very linear, and it's a little bit difficult to see in this picture, but some of the leaves are actually like curling around themselves, almost like little piggy tails. So especially at the very ends of those branches at the tips, we have leaves that are actually kind of forming a little either a piggy tail, or it also makes me think like when you go get soft serve ice cream and they make the cone and they kind of swirl it around. That's what that looks like, and it's very, very weird. This is something that I would say is fairly, like the symptomology is very distinctive. You look at that and you know there's something wrong, right? There's no way that that's just an environmental problem. I know that tomatoes can get like leaf curl, physiological leaf curl, but this is not physiological leaf curl. There is something wrong here. There are things that can mimic this, and so that's where it becomes a little tricky. And then on the right, we have red bud. Red bud also, just from my personal experience, seems to be pretty sensitive to plant growth regulator. I have some red buds in my yard. Every single year they end up getting hit. They look like this. In fact, this picture is from my front yard. Again, I don't use any herbicides, mostly because I'm really lazy and I don't. But I don't use any plant growth regulators. My neighbors don't use any plant growth regulators that I'm aware of, and their lawns certainly look like they don't use any at least broadleaf herbicides. So I don't know where this is coming from. I'm assuming that it's drifting down the street or from another block or something like that. But again, the damage we're looking for here, the leaves are somewhat distorted. In this case, they're not too bad in terms of the parallel venation, but they are a little less like round and heart-shaped than you would expect on a red bud. You also can see some cupping on some leaves in the background. Again, the very margin, the tip of the leaf along the margin, it's kind of wavy or curly. And we also have some discoloration. We have some, I call this like pixelation, where you have kind of very blocky green and yellow chunks of color. So those are our plant growth regulators. Plant growth regulators usually cause pretty severe leaf distortion. Like that's kind of, or growth distortion. That's kind of the overall kind of theme for plant growth regulators. A lot of times they're going to mimic plant hormones. And so you end up getting plants that just grow a little bit funny. They just look weird. And sometimes they look a little weird and sometimes they look extremely weird. Again, that tomato. All right, I wanted to include glyphosate as well, because that's a very common herbicide that has been used agriculturally, but is also used in urban landscapes. So plant growth regulators, most of those are going to be systemic. Like those are going to be translocated to usually to the new growth. So we tend to see symptoms occurring on the newest growth with that type of damage. Glyphosate is also systemic, and so you end up seeing, and again, in this case, it translocates to the newest growth. So you tend to see symptoms also show up on the new growth, but those symptoms are going to be different than what we saw on the plant growth regulators. So glyphosate causes what we call a yellow flash. This is a pretty, again, if I had to give like one distinctive symptom for glyphosate, it would be this yellow discoloration, or this like lightening, a white or a yellowing that occurs. In this case, the picture on the left with well, they both have a black background. The picture on the left by David, that is, it's a tomato. And you can see a yellow discoloration occurring. This is on the newest growth, and it starts at the base of the leaves. So it's going to start at the very base of the leaf where that attaches to the stem or to the vine, and then it slowly spreads upwards. And this is pretty true for a lot of plants that are sensitive to glyphosate. So this is true for tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, so on the Solanaceae family. We'll see similar symptoms in tobacco, in cucurbits, in trying to think of some of the others, but basically, and in a lot of our ornamentals as well. So this yellow flash legumes, this yellow flash, and then that starting at the base of the leaf and kind of slowly working its way upwards. On the right here, we have a picture. They just identified it as a rubris, so either like a blackberry or a raspberry. And you can see the newest growth is a little distorted and again, extremely yellowed. So the leaf that is kind of lying facing us, that's a fairly normal looking leaf. That's an older leaf. And then the leaves in the very middle of the picture, those are a little distorted. And I know that they are still developing, so that's a little bit tricky, but there is also a lot of yellowing going on there. Those should be a darker green or even maybe a bit red. But instead they are quite yellow. So again, that yellow flash. So again, continuing with glyphosate, the picture on the left, that is a tobacco plant. So the yellowing can be either fairly minor and just kind of a weird little hiccup, and then the plant recovers and it's no big deal. The yellowing can also just kind of keep progressing and the plant will eventually die. So in this case, this is a tobacco plant that was hit pretty hard with glyphosate. You can see that the new growth is entirely yellow, which is not a happy plant. And then some of the older leaves are also affected. And again, that yellowing is starting at the base of the leaves for the most part, working its way up. And again, it can be a yellow or kind of almost a white discoloration. And then on our evergreens, this pine tree has pine needle scale, it looks like, or that might be resin or pine needle scale. Anyway, the white flecks on the needles are not what we're looking at. It's the fact that the new growth is completely dead. So again, glyphosate is translocated to the new growth. So we would expect to see symptoms show up on that newest growth. And then contact herbicides, there's a really wide range of contact herbicides. So I didn't break this down into any like specific active ingredient or even mode of action. I just kind of wanted to discuss contact herbicides because they come up quite a bit. Contact herbicides, again, usually have either a spray droplet pattern, or sometimes you'll see like a runoff pattern. You'll see some like streaking almost, and it's usually like where liquid would accumulate on the leaf. So if you have a leaf that has like really deep veins, or really like a quilted appearance, kind of like a hosta, you would expect to see contact herbicide damage kind of along those veins or in those dips or valleys or things like that. When we are looking at a spray pattern, usually we're looking at either round or oval droplets. Again, contact herbicides tend to cause necrosis. So we tend to see a lot of browning or white discoloration, so death of the tissue. And usually this will show up a couple hours to a day or so after application, and it usually doesn't spread very far. This is one of the reasons why with contact herbicides, you really have to get good coverage if you want to get good control of the weed. Because again, these are not systemic. They don't move within the plant. So kind of whatever is hit is going to die, and whatever isn't hit is going to be fine. Now, if enough of that leaf surface area dies, obviously the one little island of green is not going to be able to keep it going if all the major veins are dead, for example. But you can end up with situations like this where you get kind of just some mild or moderate speckling or spotting. These individual leaves may die, but because again, it's not translocated, the new growth should appear fine. And that's actually one thing you can look for if you suspect a contact herbicide injury. You can look and see, and what does the new growth look like? And if the new growth looks healthy, then you may have a contact herbicide injury. But if the new growth looks good, it can often grow out of it. Now, again, if you have very good coverage and lots of the leaves die, or if you end up getting damage to that growing point, then that's a much bigger issue in terms of that plant surviving. So on the left here, I believe this was a squash. This is a squash plant that was affected with contact herbicide, and you can see again, kind of rounded or oval spots. In this case, they have a bit of a margin, so they're kind of tan with like a slightly darker tan margin. Not particularly characteristic. On the right, those are corn leaves. Those were hit with a contact herbicide. Again, kind of a tan bleaching with a darker brown margin. One thing that makes this sort of thing tricky for us in the plant clinic is if we get something like this, we will check for bacterial pathogens, and then we'll also check for fungal pathogens. And for those of you that remember your plant disease training, one of the ways that we encourage fungal pathogens to grow is we put them in a moisture chamber, which is a fancy word for a Tupperware box with a wet paper towel in it. But the idea is that most fungi are favored by humid conditions. And so if there are fungi there, they will start to develop, they'll start producing spores, and then we can use those spores or those fruiting structures to identify the pathogen. The problem when we get something like this is we'll put it in the moisture chamber. In fact, that's where it is right there. You can see the paper towel behind it. We'll put this in a moisture chamber to incubate it to make sure we're not missing any fungi. But in many cases, all we get are decomposers that are already feeding on the dead tissue. And so by putting them in a moist chamber, all we're doing is really encouraging the growth of all of these kind of secondary things that they're not the cause of the damage. They're just happy to consume the already dead tissue. So these can be a little bit tricky to look at in the lab to kind of try and distinguish between, is this a plant pathogen that is feeding on this plant and causing this damage, or is this just a necrotroph? Is this just something that is feeding on the dead tissue? Usually it's pretty obvious, but there are actually some fungi that can act as both, and that's where things can get a little bit tricky. Some more contact herbicide pictures. On the left, we have I believe this was a cucumber. Also, again, in the it's a cucurbit in that family. This time, there's not as much of a halo. There's just a speckling, but you can see from this picture, again, I wish I could ask you guys in person, what do you notice about this? What pattern do you notice? And I'm hoping by looking at this picture, what you're noticing is that we have a speckling pattern. It looks like spots or droplets, so that indicates potentially a contact herbicide. But also, if you look at the pattern on the whole plant, you'll notice that the older leaves are affected, but the new growth is actually beautiful. It's green, healthy, nary a spot on it. And so that new growth is growing out of it, and the plant is probably going to be fine. I even see some flowers down there. So this is the sort of thing that we can look at when we're trying to determine or assess if a contact herbicide injury occurred, is look at that new growth and see if it looks healthy, if it's growing out of it. And then on the right here, this is a crabapple with contact herbicide injury. And in this case, you can see that it's not as spotted. It's more, again, those patches or kind of the runoff or the let's just say that they got very good coverage on this plant. And so you're seeing much larger patches where some of that herbicide liquid accumulated. So when we're trying to assess if something is herbicide damage, things that we'll look for, and these are things that we look for when we receive samples at the clinic. These are things you can look for in your own yard or that you can look for in like a volunteer garden. Look for patterns. And when I say in the field, I should have said in the garden, I suppose. Again, my background is originally in corn and soybeans. But look for patterns. So where is the damage happening? If we suspect something like a drift, especially if it's something where we expect like a windborne chemical issue, then if we have plants scattered throughout the garden and only the plants on the eastern side or most of the plants on the eastern side of the garden are affected, and then plants in the middle and on the west look pretty healthy, that begins to be suspicious. It looks like maybe something moved in from the west or from the east side. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be a herbicide issue, but it starts to give us an idea of, okay, we're seeing something that seems to be moving it through the environment or moving through the garden in this particular pattern. You can also look for where water pools. Now, again, there are a lot of pathogens that are favored by wet conditions. So if you have compaction or if you have low spots or if you have water pooling, there's very good chance that you have some sort of root rot going on there as well. but some herbicides will move in water. And so you can end up having essentially like irrigation runoff. You can have issues there. You can also look in terms of patterns, what plants are affected. We mentioned earlier that you can have selective herbicides. And so if you notice that your ornamental grasses all look really healthy and they look pretty good, but that your herbaceous broadleaf ornamentals or your broadleaf trees are beginning to look weird, potentially a selective herbicide was used. If you notice that certain, if you're looking in a vegetable garden and you notice that, again, things like tomatoes or maybe the peppers are looking really curled and twisted, and the other plants don't seem to be as affected or maybe not be affected at all, again, certain plants are going to be more susceptible or more sensitive to herbicide injury than others. So you can start looking at these patterns. The patterns themselves usually don't give you a 100% confidence that this is what happened. It just starts to kind of give you ideas of what potentially could be the problem. And really, we're just trying to narrow down what could be the issue. And then when we look on the plants, we look at what tissues are affected. Is it the older growth? Is it the newer growth? Is it growing out of it? If we're looking at symptoms on the plants, is it like a marginal necrosis? Is it yellowing from the bottom of the leaf up? Are they spots? Are they blotches? Are they angular? Because angular spots tend to be more of a bacterial issue, less of a fungal or contact herbicide issue. So again, these patterns can kind of help us start peeling apart what may have occurred. So I'm going to show you some lookalikes. These are just some pictures that I found. Some of these are samples that were submitted to the clinic. A couple of them are also pictures that I found from different references. That, to me, if you showed me this picture, a lot of these, and said this was herbicide, I would say, okay, I could believe that, but none of these are. So I just think that's interesting. Again, it can be very frustrating because that means there isn't just like one distinctive symptom to look for. But just as a reminder that the world we live in is magical and amazing, and there's infinite variety. And so lots of things can look like other things. This is the tomatoes. This is actually a sample that we received, the picture on the left. And the symptoms are, again, unfortunately, this sample is very dry in this picture, but the leaves are extremely curled. They're fairly elongated. So again, there's some of that leaf strapping. They're twisted, they're curled. If you told me this was a virus or this was herbicide, I would say, okay, I mean, that looks like it would be, something that I could believe or I could get behind. And actually, this grower sent samples of this plant or samples from this field to a different diagnostic clinic, and I'm not going to say their name so I don't embarrass them. But that clinic said that they suspected viral or chemical damage, and they sent samples to us, I guess, just to double check. And I'm going to see if I can play this video. But hopefully you can see the video on the right. All those little cream colored things wriggling around, those are all mites. Those are eryaphid mites. This sample was literally crawling with eryaphid mites. And these mites, as they feed, they can cause this type of distortion, curling, leaf strapping, things like that. So good reminder to always look under the microscope to check what might be going on. But anyway, I find this video fun. I need to put like circus music behind it. But anyway, I just, that's a bunch of very happy mites enjoying the good life on that poor tomato plant. But again, twisting, curling, these symptoms can look very similar to plant growth regulator. All right, other lookalikes. So the picture on the left, this is an ornamental, I'm possibly going to say it wrong, penstemon. This, again, you've got elongation, you've got some curling, you've got some leaf distortion going on. It tends to be on the newer growth. So if you said this is plant growth regulator, for example, I'd say, okay, it checks all those boxes, the distortion, the new growth, the curling, sure. In this case, this was actually a viral disease. A lot of viruses, they basically hijack the host plant's cellular machinery to produce more viruses. And so you can often end up with extremely distorted growth. and you can end up with things that look almost like hormone imbalances in plants. So yes, in this case, actually both of these pictures are viruses. So we've got on the left, that is a virus, that was Impatiens necrotic spot virus. On the right, this is a tomato plant, and this is tobacco mosaic virus. And again, you've got that leaf strapping, you've got some discoloration, some yellowing, some rugosity, that bumping that we saw on some of the other herbicide samples. But in this case, this is just a virus that has infected this plant and is causing this type of distortion symptoms. We can have discoloration. I mentioned before that some of our herbicides are going to cause a yellowing. In this case, the picture on the left, that is a maple tree, that is chlorosis. That is a nutrient deficiency. And nutrient deficiencies can look very similar to herbicide injury, depending on the nutrient deficiency and depending on the potential herbicide. But a lot of nutrient deficiencies are going to cause discoloration, stunting, poor growth, things like that. And those are things that can also be caused by herbicides. So in this case, this is, again, it's a chlorosis that's due to a lack of a nutrient in the soil or a lack of availability of that nutrient in the soil. And so we end up with this yellowing. This is really common on like sycamore and sweet gum and sometimes on pin oak. And then obviously maple can also, I mean, it can affect a number of different types of plants. In this case, when we're talking about chlorosis, a nutrient chlorosis, kind of the telltale symptom to look for is that the leaf tissue is yellowing, and it can even become necrotic. It can turn completely brown. But all of the tissue that is affected is interveinal. So the veins themselves still stay dark green. So as you can see, like if these leaves were all the color that the veins are, they would be happy leaves, they would be very healthy. But instead we've got yellowing of the tissue between the veins, so interveinal necrosis, or in this case chlorosis, yellowing, but the veins stay dark green. So if you see that type of symptomology, my first suspect would be a nutrient deficiency or a pH problem in the soil. And then the picture on the right, that is a very unhappy milkweed plant, again from my garden. So again, not herbicide. If you look, you'll see that the newest growth is affected. It's yellowing. It just doesn't look good. It's also extremely stunted, although it's kind of hard to tell from that picture. In this case, this is a phytoplasma. So this is a disease, a pathogen. This is not a herbicide, but the yellow discoloration, the affected new growth, the crinkling, or the distortion might lead you to believe that it was some type of chemical contact. All right, just a couple more. These kind of mimic contact herbicide injury. So on the left, this is actually a soybean plant. The disease is called frog eye leaf spot. It's a fungal disease. So fungal diseases tend to cause rounded or more oval lesions. So again, they're going to look kind of like droplets. They're going to look kind of like a spray pattern. And in this case, this looks very similar to some of the spray patterns that we saw, in that the lesions are a light tan or a white, and then they've got that darker red or purple border around them. So they've got that margin. But this is classic symptomology for, again, a common soybean disease. On the right, this is on peony, and this is called measles, which is a great name. I love it. But it's these big purple blotches. And in this case, again, it's a very common fungal disease on peony, but it does kind of look like someone splashed a herbicide on this plant, because you almost see where the droplets were, and then you could even see almost where it maybe ran off the leaf, where you get those bigger blotches. And then I also just wanted to mention vascular wilts or root rots can also mimic some of our herbicide symptoms, where we'll get some discoloration. So on the left, those are peas, and they have that yellowing. So again, that discoloration going on, and eventually those will start wilting and dying. On the right, those are sunflowers that are affected with a vascular disease, verticillium wilt. And this was actually occurring across a pretty good portion of the field. In this case, it's because verticillium wilt is soil-borne. So if you start having contamination in a certain area of your field, it can slowly kind of spread. But it could also look like, you know, if it were on, like, let's say the edge of the field, it could kind of look like maybe there was a herbicide application, or that there was some type of contact there that was moving into the field. So that pattern can be a little tricky. And then we're getting close to the end. I did want to mention, so in the state of Illinois, if you suspect, or if you're talking to someone who suspects that they have herbicide injury, they have a couple of options. And one of them is to submit a Illinois Department of Agriculture pesticide misuse form. And it sounds pretty intense. There are technically punishments that can be meted out by the state. I talked with a guy I know that works at Illinois Department of Ag, and I think last year, or it was either last year or 2 years ago, I think they fined like 2 people that were extreme repeat offenders. It is highly, highly, highly unlikely. It's very rare for people to get fined. However, the state will send an inspector out. That inspector can take samples and then submit those samples to chemical residue testing labs to see what, if anything, is present on that plant material. Also, this does help the state kind of recognize if there are problems. So as I mentioned, there are new formulations of dicamba that recently, a couple of years ago, hit the market, and the number of complaints that they received skyrocketed. And that's what made them realize that they needed to start regulating the use of dicamba a little bit more than what the label said. And that's why our state has these cutoffs earlier in the season than what is recommended federally. But our state, Illinois is able to make basically their own requirements for use of dicamba. And it's based on the fact that there were so many complaints based on when this herbicide was applied and given our environment. So, there are other things to consider in terms of you don't want to upset your neighbors, and there can be sore feelings. So I don't want to say it's just always the easiest thing to do to fill out this form, but there are some benefits to doing that. So I wanted to give you these 2 resources. On the left is it Spray Drift and What Do I Do? This is an excellent article. It was written by Michelle, and it is available on the Home Yard and Garden Pest newsletter. It's from 2020, but if you just go to the Home Yard and Garden Pest newsletter and search for Spray Drift, this should pop up. And it talks about the entire process. So it talks about like what the state will do, how it will be handled, things like that. On the right, that is the pesticide incident complaint form, which sounds extremely official. And that is the actual form from the state of Illinois, and it's available at that incredibly long and basically useless hyperlink right there. However, I am going to make these slides available after this presentation, so that way you have it if you need it. And again, if you Google Illinois Department of Ag pesticide misuse, this form should come up. The big thing to keep in mind with the Illinois Department of Ag misuse form is that you have 30 days from the application or from when you see symptoms develop to contact or to submit the form. So if you see something happen in spring and then you wait until July to submit that form, they'll take the form, but they're not going to act on it. They're not going to send a inspector out. The nice thing with them sending an inspector out is they can basically require nearby applicators to give them access to their records, so they can find out exactly what was applied and when. And as I mentioned, they can also take samples and submit them to pesticide residue testing labs. Those samples can sometimes, okay, I should say, to the best of my knowledge, as I understand it, that sampling is done for free. And that's really nice because if you submit a sample yourself to some of these labs, it can run in the couple $100s. And then these are some of the things that we do when we receive samples at the plant clinic and we suspect a herbicide injury. And I put diagnosing in quotes because at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic, we actually cannot test for any type of chemical residue. So we never confirm that there is a herbicide contact or that there is chemical residue on those plants because we can't. We don't have the machinery to do so. What we will do is we will rule out other possibilities. And then we can say that it is highly symptomatic or highly suggestive of, or it fits the symptoms we would expect to see or something like that. So when we receive in samples, especially if people are worried about herbicide contact, we obviously examine the plant, we record what symptoms we see. We also look, again, under the microscope, we will incubate it, we might culture it. So we're looking for other possibilities that may be causing those symptoms. We examine the area, although we usually don't do that type of field visit, but I would encourage people to examine the area or ask for a history. So again, examine the garden, examine the field, look for those patterns we talked about. And then when you're asking for the history, things like any type of application, because again, when you're talking with homeowners, a lot of times they won't necessarily realize that a spring lawn application often involves or often includes some type of herbicide. So they'll say, if you ask what herbicides did you apply, they might say, oh, nothing this year, without realizing that there were actually herbicides that were contained in that product. But because they weren't using it kind of as a herbicide, they may not recognize that. So ask for a history of any applications that occurred. You can also ask for a history of like, when did the symptoms occur? We get people that are adamant that they have herbicide injury in July because they saw a airplane fly over, an applicator fly over the field down the road from them, and then their plants started wilting, and therefore it must be due to the herbicide that was applied. Usually herbicides aren't being applied to agronomic fields in July or August. That was probably a fertilizer or a fungicide or something along those lines. Probably not a herbicide. So ask for that history of when the symptoms occurred and does that kind of fit. Also keep in mind contact herbicides tend to show up, the injury shows up a lot more quickly than systemic. Rule out other possibilities. Again, that's what we do at the clinic. We can rule out that it's an insect issue or a mite issue, or that we're seeing fungal growth or bacterial or viral pathogens, things like that. However, again, without testing, we can't confirm it. And the reason that I keep stressing that is that there are horror stories, there are cautionary tales in diagnostic circles of plant clinic diagnosticians or plant clinic directors who have been called to court because someone submits a sample, you say, oh, this looks like herbicide damage, and then they sue their neighbor, or they sue the farmer down the road, or they sue their lawn care company thinking that they accidentally had contamination in the tank that they used to spray the fertilizer, or whatever it is. And so now you're in court trying to explain that when you said it was herbicide, you meant, well, it looks like herbicide, but you don't have any definitive proof for that. And that's a situation that I do not want to get into. So we always say highly suspect, extremely symptomatic of, we've ruled out all these other things. This is a kind of classic symptoms for this type of herbicide, but we cannot confirm it. And so with that, I just want to mention two things really quickly. I've mentioned the University of Illinois Plant Clinic a couple of times. This is our contact information if you're not familiar with us, but we do a bunch of different diagnoses and different services. So we can and will do insect, mite, fungal, viral, bacterial, different types of disease issues. And then if we have something that is an abiotic issue, including herbicide, but also things like edema or drought or nutrient issues or things like that, we can say that, the symptoms fit these patterns, but we usually can't test specifically for those. And then we also do have a fact sheet specifically on plant growth regulator website, or excuse me, plant growth regulator herbicides. It's available on our website. Again, this link will be in the slides that I will send, and that way if anyone wants a copy of the slides, they have them. And with that, I'm only 3 minutes over, which is really, really good for me, honestly, if you've ever sat through any of my other presentations. So with that, thank you very much. Again, I really appreciate getting to come out and talk with you guys. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat, or Jenny and Valerie, I don't know if you want to open it up for microphone. I don't know if you guys have a preferred way of doing it. I see that there are some questions or comments in the chat, so I'm looking through those right now. Okay, Denise said per illinois.gov, June 12th is the dicamba spray cutoff date in 2023. Yeah, so again, that cutoff date in June is actually earlier than the label, but because it's a state issue, they're able to restrict that use. Where does the state of Illinois report the number and location of pesticide or herbicide misuse incidents? I'm actually not sure, but that's a really good question. So I am going to write that down, and I'm going to ask my colleague at Department of Ag, and I will send the answer to, can I send that to Valerie? Would that be the right thing to do to get back to the group?
Yes, you can send it to me.
Okay. So let me just scribble that down. Okay. What can be done for peonies that have measles? Okay, yeah, there are contact fungicides that work really well. Let me look that up really quickly. The good news is probably not going to kill your peonies, the measles, not the fungicides. Well, the fungicides won't either. Anyway, the measles aren't going to kill your peonies, but it does make them a little unsightly and it can weaken them slightly. So peonies are one of my favorite plants. And often what I will do is I will spray a fungicide when I see the fungal diseases starting to get bad and making my plants look unhappy. And then the next year they look great, and the year after that they look pretty good, and the year after that they are beginning to look a bit ratty, and then I'll spray again like the 4th year. So it's not something that you necessarily have to do every year. You can if you want to, as long as you follow the label. But often it can be kind of good just to knock down the population of the pathogen. Mancozeb works pretty well. There are other contact fungicides that you can use, but mancozeb is usually, I think, what's recommended. So, but if you go to a garden center or a big box store, a fungicide that's labeled for use on herbaceous ornamentals against foliar fungal leaf spots should do the trick. What about crop duster damage? An arborist examined my oak trees and my redbud. He strongly suspected herbicide drift. Yeah, and that's rough. And so this is one thing that becomes really problematic. And you may have read in the news, there are stories of very contentious neighborhood relations or neighbor relations, especially in rural areas. There's been violence. There's actually been a couple of murders around herbicide injury. So it can get bad. In terms of protecting your plants, especially if you live somewhere in a more rural area where you are likely going to get contact from commercial ag, or you're more likely to get contact from commercial ag, there's not much you can do in terms of protecting your plants, right? Like you can't put up like a big plastic shield or anything. However, the couple things I would recommend are keep those plants really healthy. If we're talking about trees, mulch them, ideally to the drip line or even beyond. Water them regularly when you can, fertilize them appropriately, prune out dead wood during dry season. So, just do everything you can to keep those plants really healthy. Again, my redbud gets hit every year, still blooms every spring, still puts out pods. It's currently loaded with pods, in fact. It comes back every year. So if it's a whiff of a herbicide, if the leaves are slightly distorted, hopefully it's not doing too much long-term damage. If it is, it's probably causing some stress to that tree. So anything you can do to reduce stress on that tree is going to help counteract some of the effects of that herbicide. If we're talking about ornamental, like smaller ornamentals, so shrubs or even like herbaceous ornamentals, you can actually put up essentially barriers. So there are certain plants that are less susceptible or less sensitive. I keep using the word susceptible because I'm used to talking about diseases. There are plants that are less sensitive to herbicide issues. I want to say, but if I say it, then I'm going to be wrong. I want to say some of the conifers can be a little bit more sturdy or hardy against some of the herbicides, but now that I say that, I'd want to double check. But basically, you can build like a living barrier, and this is actually recommended for like vineyards, for example. So if you are growing, if you're growing plants that are known to be extremely sensitive to some of these herbicides, especially herbicides that can move long distances, like plant growth regulators, there are recommendations for barrier plants that can be used. And the idea is that having those plants, it's kind of like a windbreak, but it's a chemical break, if you will. They've been used with, I think, some success for vineyards I know in Iowa, I attended a presentation about vineyards, and in I think maybe Missouri as well. So if you have like flowers or vegetables that you're trying to protect, you could consider putting up some sort of barrier like that. But that's also a pretty big investment, and that's a lot of effort, but that is one thing to consider. Really what I'd say is, again, just keep those plants as healthy as you can. And if you notice something egregious, like if it's like my redbud, I will never call Illinois Department of Ag on because it happens every year. It's not hurting the plant that much. And I also frankly don't care enough. But if you have a year where the damage seems to be particularly severe or particularly problematic, then contacting Illinois Department of Ag would not be inappropriate, in my opinion. And let's see, my favorite plant pathogen. We recently had a regional plant diagnostics meeting, and we went around the table and we introduced ourselves and then had to say what our favorite plant pathogen was. My favorite plant pathogen is powdery mildew. That's actually more of a disease. There are a lot of different pathogens that can cause powdery mildew, but they're all related. I just think that powdery mildew is fun. You can find it everywhere, so it's really great in terms of teaching, and it makes the most beautiful reproductive structures. Again, if you ever have, we'll say, the pleasure of doing disease diagnostics training with me, you'll probably hear me wax poetic about Cleistothecia, which are just these really beautiful reproductive structures of powdery mildew. And I think they're gorgeous, and they're like little tiny works of art that are microscopic. And so it's like, every time I see one, it's like I'm let in on a little secret. So I love powdery mildew. And other people being very, very kind. With regards to vapor drift, are we breathing in this vapor? Do current regulations control vapor drift? Okay, so that's actually a really good question, because again, this issue of herbicide injury is something that is very common across the Midwest. So again, we actually had some seminars on it at this regional meeting that we went to. And some people were talking, some of the other diagnosticians from other states were talking about getting videos from some of their clients, and their clients are like standing outside filming an applicator, and you can like see the clouds of chemicals coming like off of the applicator and like basically hitting the person that's filming. And it's like, well, that's probably not a great idea. You don't want to be standing directly downstream of that. I do want to say though that herbicides, before they are labeled for use, before they're available for use in the United States, they do have to go through some pretty strict FDA approval, or I think it would be FDA approval. They have to go through a regulatory process. And so usually what they'll end up doing is they will use modeling. They may use animal models as well, but they will try to determine level, like exposure rates, acceptable exposure rates. You may have heard of LD50, which is the lethal dose for 50%. Obviously we want it to be way less than that, but that is one kind of threshold that can be used when you start working on chemicals, not by the time they're actually released to the public. But the idea being that, you know, they go through pretty intensive testing. The idea is to look for adverse reactions, and that can include, I guess, diseases we would call something like cancer. I mean, that can include something that's like chronic and problematic, like very problematic, like life-threatening. It could also include things like asthma or allergies. And so the idea is that they kind of set these baselines and they say, well, we don't see adverse effects under these levels. And then they usually go down quite a bit from there in terms of what can legally be applied. So generally speaking, and I want to make this very broad because the different types of herbicide classes are also going to affect this, and also individual physiology. So individual people are probably going to be more sensitive or less sensitive. But generally speaking, the general public is not getting exposed to enough herbicide for it to be a huge issue. Also keep in mind, herbicides are usually pretty specific in terms of their mode of action. A lot of them are going to do things like impact chlorophyll development, which doesn't really have a big impact on us because we don't produce chlorophyll. Or they're going to impact, again, root development or things like that. So they try to keep them pretty specific to plants, not to animals or mammals especially. And then there are very strict limits on exposure. It does change if you're an applicator, because obviously if you are an applicator, you are exposed at much higher levels. And so at that point, you know, you do want to be really, really serious about things like your protective gear, making sure that things are being disposed of properly so you're not coming into contact with contaminated material, like containers or applicator equipment or things like that, because you have a much higher chance of coming into contact, and then you also have a higher chance of coming into repeated contact. But again, I would say for the general public, the risk is very low. not an epidemiologist, but from my understanding. And okay, and there's a link in the chat about I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, but there is a link with yes, mitigating herbicide injury with windbreaks. Thank you. This is actually excellent. So this is one thing that we talked about, that if you are using some type of windbreak or some type of plant barrier, that barrier does need to be really, really dense, because you're basically hoping that it's going to act as a wind barrier, but even more than a wind barrier, because you're hoping to help trap some of those vapors. So it does have to be an extremely dense row. And from what I'm seeing on this link, which is excellent, thank you. Yes, and they actually stack multiple plants. That's interesting. Okay. So yeah, I mean, again, if you're establishing a new garden, and if it's especially somewhere in like a rural area where you would expect to get more contact or potential contact, if possible, I would say consider something like this. And it can also double as your windbreak. But again, this is a pretty big investment in terms of money, and also in terms of just space to put something like this in your garden. So if you can, I think it's a great idea. I don't know that it's going to be practically applicable to everyone. And then, what is the recommendation from the U of I with regards to damage to garden vegetables by lawn chemicals not recommended used to be consumed by the EPA? So, I mean, and I'll be honest, this is something that I would double check with like the pesticide safety education group on. In fact, I will do so, and I will email Valerie and let her know. My gut reaction would be that if you have a vegetable or a fruit, if you have a food plant that has been exposed to chemicals that are not labeled for use on food plants, I probably wouldn't eat it, which is a shame. But that would be my first reaction. I think it is also going to depend on if it's a systemic or a contact herbicide, because if it's that, you know, your green bean plants get hit with a contact herbicide and the older growth doesn't look great, but then the new growth comes out of it and the new growth is fine, and then they start producing beans, I would think that that should be okay. I will still double check that for you though. But I would assume that that would be probably not a huge problem, because again, that contact herbicide, it's going to have had its effect on the older growth, and then that should be it. It's not moving systemically. If, however, it's a systemic herbicide, there's a good chance that some of that herbicide ended up in the fruit or in the vegetables, and that is a bigger issue. So my gut reaction would be, I probably would not eat that food, especially if it's a systemic. However, I will double check with the PSEP group, and I will include that information to Valerie as well. And then, oh, Ruth put in the chat some of the plants that are recommended as that herbicide barrier. Awesome. Okay.
Diane, thank you so much for so much information. I think we're all on overload. It's all been great.
It's a lot.
It is, but it's been wonderful, and you've done an awesome job of explaining things to us, and we really appreciate you taking time to do this with us.
Oh, no problem. Again, I always enjoy coming out, getting to see people, getting to talk with people, and thank you so much for spending your beautiful Tuesday evening with me, because it is so lovely outside. I think we're all very excited to be back in the garden, hopefully not with too much herbicide or disease issues going on this early in the season.
Yeah, and I do have to say, somebody else wrote in there, come back soon. So we'll have you come talk to us again sometime.
Absolutely. I would love to.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everybody for showing up.
Yep. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.